Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. In this episode, we will continue our exploration of amnesia, which is the isolated loss of memory. In this episode, I'll be speaking to Lauren Aguirre to discuss her book, The Memory Thief. This examines an emerging cause of acute amnesia called opioid-associated amnesic syndrome. The Memory Thief earned the 2022 P. and E.O. Wilson Science Literary Award as a finalist. As a staff member of the PBS series Nova, she produced documentaries, short-form video series, podcasts, interactive games, and blogs. Lauren's articles on memory and addiction have appeared in Stat, the Boston Globe, Undark, the Atlantic, the Scientist, and PBS. She's currently working on a historical novel set in the early 1900s at a colony for people with epilepsy in upstate New York. This looks like something that would be quite interesting to see. Lauren, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast, and I'm most grateful that you accepted my invitation and that you're here today.
Thank you. I'm grateful that you invited me, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you very much. The first question is, why did you write the book? Why did you write a book on opioid amnesia?
Well, I really wanted to go deeper into a specific topic than you can do, even in an hour-long documentary. You can't go too deep. And I also wanted to be able to focus on the human side of science and of medical science in particular. So a book would give me the opportunity to do that. And really, and I had never written a book, and I had produced lots of other types of media. So I thought, let's try this. And the story was very, very interesting to me.
Good. And as a first-time author, how did you go about writing it? What kind of jotting things along the way or setting time out?
Fortunately, I got a grant from the Sloan Foundation to cover my research time, and there was a lot of research time. So I went back and looked. I interviewed about 100 people. A combination of neuroscientists, neurologists, people who had suffered from this syndrome, family members of them, public health officials. And it was sort of a two-prong research strategy because there was the basic neuroscience, and there was also the story of what happened to these people with amnesia. And I wove back and forth between them in the book. And it covers a lot of different types of medicine and science. So it was a huge undertaking to research it. And I'm in Boston. And so they have these open to the public, although I think I was the only lay person who went, neuroscience seminars, very, very nerdy, very, but I would just go to them, once a week and kind of absorb what was going on. And that was also how I saw really what was happening at the forefront of research.
Yeah. And you did talk about patients, and I think the first patient you talked about in the book was Owen Rivers, this 25-year-old gentleman who had overdosed on fentanyl and was found by his friends impaired. And then Jed Barash, who is kind of the neurologist at the center of your book, also came across another patient called Max. And I was interested in the way you put it. Max found himself in a kind of limbo, a never-ending present. What was happening more widely around that time? That was about 2017.
So actually, the case report came out in 2017. So that was 2012 when he came into the hospital, and that was the very beginning of the fentanyl epidemic in Massachusetts. So that was one of the things that sort of caught Barash's attention was he'd never seen anything like this before. So what has changed? And Max assumed he'd taken heroin, but why would this have happened to him and no one else when lots of people, unfortunately, are overdosing on fentanyl? And then so Barash and his colleagues at Leahy Hospital all agreed this was very unusual, but they hadn't seen anything like it. And like all doctors, they're very busy. So it sort of went in the back of their mind, unusual case, but what to do with it until another patient came in from New Hampshire who had the same thing had happened to him. He also thought he'd taken heroin. So once there were two cases with this very unusual presentation, that's really what got Barash and his colleagues at Leahy going and saying, are there more? What are we missing?
And I think the thing that struck Jed Barash was the MRI scan of Owen and Max. You wrote that Max's brain scan is in a category all its own. Maybe not a fair question, but what was so striking about the hippocampus in those scans that struck out?
Oh, no, that's a fair question. I mean, that's at the heart of it, really, which is, normally on a brain scan with this type of acute imaging after an injury, you see injury more widely. It won't be very specifically tied to one brain structure and nowhere else. And this was, as Barash put it, like someone had taken his neuroanatomy textbook and colored in the hippocampus. Except on this type of scan, the hippocampus appears white, bright white, and the rest is sort of gray.
Interesting. And there was something distinctive about the presentation, which I think I got with Owen's presentation, was this repetitive questioning, wasn't it? Asking the same questions over and over, which we kind of tend to see with transient global amnesia, but kind of not the right age group. Was there anything specific apart from that with the memory loss of fentanyl amnesia, after the repetitive questioning? Is there any kind of thing that gives you a clue you might be?
Well, it was classic anterograde amnesia. Not surprising since it was the hippocampus that was very specifically damaged. But in contrast to, say, someone with Alzheimer's, this was so acute. They went from before they took the drug to being totally fine to not being able to remember anything, not to be able to form any new memories, the classic definition of anterograde amnesia. So they still knew who they were. They knew all their past. They were just stuck, as I said, in this limbo. And initially, in the first few days, it was really, 30 seconds. He couldn't retain it for longer than that. It gradually got a little bit better, but very, very slowly. And actually, now he's doing a lot better.
Which is interesting, given the severity of the damage that this improvement comes in.
Yeah.
I suspect it's to do with the fact that you have stem cells in the hippocampus. Otherwise, it's quite surprising that the patients with this improved. Was Barash surprised by that? Kind of.
It could be that. It could be some rewiring around the damage. It could be compensation, other brain areas kind of kicking in. In the case of Owen, he still has pretty bad anterograde amnesia, but it's more specific to kind of geographical stuff. Like he has no idea where he parked his car, those sorts of things. But he has great semantic memory and great executive function. And that's what's so interesting about this. Usually with the brain injury, you might find more diffuse problems, but this is very, very specific. And in fact, he's graduating this month, I think, with a degree in clinical social work. So he has worked around this very severe injury. Yeah.
It's interesting. And I mean, what was striking again with Max, which you said Barash thought he could be more HM than HM. HM being Henry Molaison, the unfortunate man who had epilepsy and had surgery and kind of lost his memory. Did Barash think Max's case was kind of purer than that of Molaison? Is that some who can learn a lot more about memory function from Max's brain, say from Molaison?
Well, I would say purer, yes, in the sense that HM's surgery was not clean. They didn't even know how much exactly was taken out, and other areas might have been damaged. And then he had severe epilepsy for many, many years and had taken a lot of heavy duty medication. So it's not really known what his cognitive state was before before that surgery. Whereas with these patients, even though most of them hadn't had imaging or cognitive testing beforehand, they weren't injured. So in that sense, it's more pure. But in terms of learning about memory function, I think memory and the role of the hippocampus, this kind of injury isn't going to get you closer to understanding exactly how that works. The value is more as a hypothesis generator in terms of what can damage the hippocampus and therefore memory.
Okay, that sounds reasonable. Patient HM is such an icon in neurology that
Yeah.
yeah, it would be difficult to knock him off, I suppose.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. So Barash suspected very early on that there was a serious public health issue going on with fentanyl amnesia. Um, but the New York City Department of Health and the CDC were more cautious. They wanted to see more cases, understandably. How did he
Yeah.
go about doing this and convincing the CDC, which reasonably, with 2 cases, is difficult for them to think an epidemic was going on? How did he go about getting cases?
So it took a lot longer to convince the CDC, and that makes sense. They have a lot going on their plate, and 2 cases does not seem like a public health crisis. Um, and it was actually the Massachusetts Department of Public Health that he worked with. And this is a theme that sort of runs throughout the book that I think is very interesting in medicine, which is it depends a lot on relationships. So he had previously worked with the head of the Department of Public Health, Al DeMaria, on a paper. So they had a relationship and they knew each other to be reasonable people. So when Barish contacted him, he thought, I should listen to this. But he also said 2 cases isn't enough. I can't justify putting limited resources on this. Go find some more and we'll talk.
which which he did.
Which
Um,
is Yeah. So
and
he went through with his colleagues because he also had people at Leahy who said, I've never seen anything like this. Like it was the radiologist Juan Small who was like, I truly don't know what this is. So he also enlisted an MD PhD student from Tufts, Monroe Butler, to look back, through PubMed and also look through hospital records to see, did anyone come in who met this profile, who had overdosed and who had unexplained amnesia. So they did ultimately find 2 more cases. They got that published in Neurocase, which is a small journal out of UCSF in San Francisco. And they also got the Department of Public Health to say, okay, let's see if there are more cases out there. And they sent out an email to all physicians saying, have you seen someone who's overdosed who has amnesia? And if they have an MRI as well, great. But a lot of people who overdose on drugs will never get an MRI and will often be discharged before, anyone really knows what's going on.
and he got it in Neurocase because the bigger journal, JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, you said gunned it down.
Yeah.
I suspect quite often when something new comes, the orthodox journals tend to be very, very cautious, isn't it? Almost every big breakthrough has to go kind of through a smaller avenue before it gets to the public.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
did get into the New England Journal, which is a big one. Uh,
Yeah.
but a lot of people criticized the New England Journal paper. What were they worried about? What was the concern?
Well, I think the main thing is it flies in the face of clinical experience, especially for anesthesiologists, because they've used fentanyl safely for years and years, all over the world. They're not seeing people with amnesia. So how could it possibly be fentanyl? And I think the answer to that is that twofold, that these people are being supported. Their breathing isn't suppressed, which is certainly a factor in damaging the hippocampus. And also they're almost always given another drug, I think usually midazolam, which does counteract the effect of fentanyl in terms of overexciting the hippocampus. So this is why they wouldn't have seen it. But they also don't follow people long term to see how's your memory, you know? So, in fact, I wrote a whole article about anesthesia and what's safe and what's not. And not a single anesthesiologist who I spoke with had ever considered whether fentanyl might be playing a role in this post-operative cognitive disorder that they often see with patients, especially older patients.
Interesting. And sometimes you have these cases just hiding in plain sight, isn't it? That just nobody has just put two and two together. It's quite impressive
Yeah.
that Jed Barash did that very early on.
Yeah.
You did mention anesthetists, and one of the heroes for me in your book was Andrew Kofke. I presume that's the spelling of his surname.
Yep.
As far as the 1980s, he suspected that fentanyl was causing a damage to the hippocampus. Why did he think so? And how did he try to prove it?
I went back and looked at his interview because I was trying to remember why he thought so. I think the starting point was he was asked to consult on a case of someone with severe epilepsy. Um, and they were wondering, and they needed to, I think, put them under to control the seizures. And they wanted advice on what anesthesia to use. And he realized there was no data about this. Like, what would you do with someone with epilepsy? Is there one drug over another? And then he started testing and found that opioids could cause seizures in some cases. And that really launched him on his journey. I will say that I also have epilepsy, and whenever I need some sort of procedure, I always say, I'd rather not have fentanyl, and they think I'm insane.
Okay.
Um, but this guy was from Mass General Hospital where in Boston, which is where I get my treatment. So, I mean, I think slowly, slowly the word will get out, but they don't stratify patients and look at what drugs would be better for this person or that person.
No, I don't think precision anesthesia has reached that
Yeah.
stage. But
Yeah.
eventually, probably there'll be a test that can pick
Yeah.
that. And he also had the insight, that's Kofke had the insight to link the risk of fentanyl damage to the ApoE4 gene mutation, which is linked with Alzheimer's disease. That
Yeah.
was quite a very bold leap for him. What kind of hypothesis was he putting forward then?
Um, let's see if I remember exactly. Like that gene had just been identified. Oh, I mean, it's sort of basic. It's because the hippocampus is damaged in Alzheimer's and the hippocampus is damaged in this case. So is that more than a coincidence? And so that was sort of led him on the path to do that experiment. I think he had about 27 people who participated, and the ApoE4 carriers had much more activation in the hippocampus, which is, I mean, on the face of it, that sounds like a good thing to have a lot of activation in your hippocampus, but it's actually not necessarily, there can be too much. And in fact, that's increasingly recognized as a feature of Alzheimer's early on in the disease progression, that it's overactive. And the early thinking was, oh, it's compensating for memory loss, but in fact, it interferes with memory loss and might be contributing to memory loss.
Okay. It will be interesting to see if
Yeah,
eventually all of these tie up together. It's all happening.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, and you had your own experience of transient amnesia. You said when you noticed everything you knew slipped away. What was the circumstance? Was it around surgery as well? Or?
No, no, no. It was the first, it was a seizure.
No.
It's called jamais vu, never been seen. And I had had deja vus leading up to that, but didn't think anything of it. Like everyone's had deja vu, right? But if you have it frequently, it's a problem. But jamais vu is more like a disassociation from your personhood. Like I just didn't know who I was or where I was or what century it was. So it wasn't like anterograde amnesia. I think
Unfamiliar.
it was more scary, actually.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, that was very transient, thankfully. Um,
very true. Yeah.
and another, I mean, not related to opioid amnesia, you also talked about George Carrillo, who is another kind of famous neurological patient.
Yeah.
condition gave insights to Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
Did you think there was something similar between George Carrillo and Max and Owen, apart from kind of
Yeah.
exposures to toxic?
Well, I think the similarity is that it was also heroin, but it was a synthetic heroin with a contaminant. And it also targeted a very specific part of the brain, in that case, the substantia nigra, and that's why they developed symptoms of Parkinsonianism. But it was it was sort of an intriguing connection for Barash, because they identified the contaminant that caused this damage, and then that allowed them to create an animal model to test drugs and theories about Parkinson's.
Yeah,
So the goal was, oh, okay, if we show that fentanyl is causing this damage to the hippocampus, what might we be able to learn about Alzheimer's disease, let's say?
yes. MPTP model of
Right.
Parkinson's. It's still a bit of controversy about that.
Yeah,
But I think science cannot progress without models.
that's
It's
right.
wrong. They eventually lead us to the right model. And another interesting fellow who I've gone on to read since I read your book was Clive Wearing, the musician, had profound amnesia, but this one is from viral encephalitis.
Yeah.
What I was interested in his case was this rehabilitation approach that seemed to help him, although not immediately. Um, was that kind of a rehab approach applied to people with opioid amnesia? What exactly was that approach?
Well, it's to fix the environment around them. If you can't address the brain injury, because usually after about 2 years, you've seen as much improvement as you're going to see. So try to harness other memory systems, primarily procedural memory, which was, I believe, unimpaired in him, and usually in other people with amnesia. So just habitually training and retraining and retraining, so that you remember how to do things like take your morning medicine and make your coffee, because it's associated with a procedure, with your sort of motor memory. And then obviously keeping them safe and finding ways to tap into other things that might give them pleasure. Like Clive Wearing could still play music and conduct, and that part of his brain was completely unimpaired, which was really quite amazing.
It's interesting how music seems to be resistant to all sorts of ravages. Even in
Yeah.
Alzheimer's disease, it seems to kind of be preserved right to the end. Uh,
Yeah.
okay. The last part of your book was titled Outstanding Questions.
Mhm.
Doors do you think fentanyl amnesia has opened for neuroscience research or memory research? Do you think it's
Um,
for the
I
prospect?
think it's open doors that have not been walked through, and that really speaks to kind of very slow progress in medical science, and um, what we were talking about earlier with it's hard to get people to pay attention to something that is just brand new, that doesn't build on other research. It's easy to sort of dismiss it, and case reports specifically are seen as kind of the lowest level in the hierarchy of evidence. But actually, they're really the only thing that are going to show you something new. So I think, you know, ideally there's a little more humility in the field about, yeah, we don't know everything, and we should pay attention to these outliers. But also the way science is funded is, um, there really isn't money for something that's out there, and especially if it crosses fields, as this does, with addiction and neurology, public health, epidemiology. So I think that's pretty tough. I mean, so the things that are at least one study is funded, and that's to look at the effect of chronic high dose opioids in pain patients, and to see whether there's hippocampal volume loss and memory loss in pain patients who take opioids versus pain patients who take some other kind of pain control, because pain in and of itself can also damage the hippocampus. So you have to control for that. So that study is ongoing. There is some funding to do animal studies with fentanyl, to see, what impact that has on cognition. There's also a new opioid-associated syndrome is also now in the ICD-10 classification system as of last October, which means there'll be a lot more data on the prevalence of this, because every person who comes into the ER will get a code. And if they meet these criteria, they'll get that code. But yeah, so it's
open.
the potential is still untapped. The other hope that Barash had was to test naltrexone, which is used for addiction, to see if that would counteract hyperactivity and potentially be a pretty benign and inexpensive treatment for Alzheimer's. And he continually gets people saying that's a great idea, actually, but it doesn't go along with my research and I can't do it. And so I think this is a problem in the Alzheimer's field, that people recognize there's a limited pool of participants for clinical trials. And of course, there's limited funding. So I think there's a big barrier to trying new things. And the continued emphasis on amyloid beta, I think, is really unfortunate, because it crowds out other possible avenues for exploration.
Yeah, it's a paradigm that's so well established. I know a lot of people are trying to knock it off, the amyloid hypothesis.
Yeah.
I mean, Barash did all this work without being in a research position, isn't it? It kind of used his own time and interest.
Yeah.
And clearly that means there's so much he can do outside the standard research area. What's the status of the epidemic now? Has it fizzled out, or is it fizzling out because we now know it's out there, or it's...
Oh no. Well, they'll find out when the data starts coming in from the ICD-10. There's sort of this paradoxical thing that happens, which is, now that it's a known phenomenon, it's not reported. You're not going to see a case report. I still get emails occasionally from people who say, my nephew, overdosed on fentanyl, can't form new memories now. So it's definitely still happening, because the fentanyl epidemic is not going anywhere.
And again, and journals, as you said, don't kind of favor doing single case reports, but I think that's the only way to know what's going on around the world.
Yeah.
Okay. I know we talked about a lot of lessons from your book. Are there any other lessons you kind of say you thought you would like to let your readers take away from the book?
Yeah, so we've talked about some of it, like the barriers to progress. I think it's a real challenge to be open to new ideas and also sufficiently skeptical. And you have to hold those two ideas in mind. So that's tough. I think the role of serendipity in medicine is pretty interesting. Like, people coming together, often just by happenstance, and having the same interest, and saying, oh, we could work together, or did you know about this? Did you know about that? I mean, I think people picture science and medicine as being like very organized and very rational, and it's just not. So I think that's a takeaway. And then also there's the kind of don't give up story that I like, both from Barash and his colleagues, and also Owen Rivers. I think he's an incredible testament to, don't give up and make something of your life if you can. And he succeeded at that.
Yeah, and that's a very strong, I think that's a very strong message from the book. I was impressed by how far Barash went to kind of follow his intuition. Okay. Are you working on any book? I know you...
Yes. Yeah, it's quite different. I said I was interested in the memory thief story partially because of the human angle and how it affects people. And I enjoyed that part of it so much that I decided I wanted to really focus on that. And I think there are themes you can explore and insights into the human condition that you can explore in a novel that you really can't do in nonfiction. You know, what is the impact? But it's a similar story in the sense that it's what's it like to have a neurological disorder that is mysterious and untreatable? And what does that do to your sense of self? Not just how other people see you, but how you see yourself. So mine is a historical novel, you know, as you mentioned, set in the early 1900s, at a time when epilepsy was really stigmatized and people were considered inferior and they were going to contaminate the blood of the human race. And so they really needed to be separated from society. So what was that like?
I suspect there'll be a bit of eugenics in there as well, if that was the time.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Just before we round up, are there are you able to give me 3 books you kind of recommend to
Yeah.
listeners about this topic or anything about the brain?
Yeah. So I really enjoyed a book by A.J. Lees, who's a neurologist in the UK, called Mentored by a Madman, about William Burroughs, who was, you know, a writer and very interesting person who tried lots of drugs in the Amazon. And so it's about that, but it's also about the same idea of how medicine progresses and the problem with how it progresses today, where it's sort of very corporatized and it's hard to try things that are sort of out of the mainstream. He talks about neurology having lost its soul. And another one that I thought was really interesting was called, I think, The Biology of Desire. It was, I think, another UK person, Mark Lewis, who argues that it's not a disease. That's not a helpful way to think about it. It's more of a learning disorder. And The Brain from the Inside Out by Yuri Buzaki. I think he's at NYU. So he's a neuroscientist and he just has a very, very different way of looking at the brain. From the inside out. You know, we humans say, oh, what's memory for? And, you know, we bring our own what we care about
Mm.
to the study of the brain, and the brain doesn't care. So like he sort of tries to start from first principles, what's going on in the brain. And he talks about memory as being pattern matching.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, 3 very different books, but all interesting.
Okay, thank you. That adds to my reading list at least. Lauren, thank you very much for accepting my invitation to participate in this podcast. I'm very grateful and I've enjoyed our talk. To my audience, thank you so much for listening. Or if you are watching this, thank you for your audience. If you found the topic enlightening, you might consider subscribing to my neurology database called Neuro Checklist. And I've also written a book called Surfing the Brain, which kind of gives snippets of different aspects of neurology. And to ensure you don't miss the next episode of this podcast, why not subscribe either to the iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube channels? And until then, thank you very much for joining me. And Lauren, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.